Helen had never intended to live a life that revolved around one person, but when her husband walked out the door without a goodbye and left her with a newborn baby and a stack of unpaid bills, she had no choice but to become everything to that child. She was only 26 when she found herself holding her son Jacob in a silent hospital room, praying for strength and promising him in a whisper that she would never leave him the way his father did. From that moment on, her life became a series of quiet sacrifices, ones she never spoke of, not because she didn't feel them, but because she believed that love meant not keeping score. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3. She mopped floors in the morning, answered phones in the afternoon, and cleaned hotel rooms at night, all while making sure Jacob had homemade lunches, clean uniforms, and someone to clap for him at school assemblies. She never let him see her cry, even when the refrigerator broke and she had to eat stale crackers for 3 days just so Jacob could have milk for his cereal. She told him everything was fine, even when her back ached and her fingers bled and her rent was overdue. Because he was just a child and children should be allowed to dream freely, not worry about how the lights would stay on. Every decision she made was filtered through the question what would be best for Jacob. She never remarried, never even dated seriously again, she told herself. It was because she didn't have time, but the truth was deeper. She didn't want anyone walking into their life only to leave again and break Jacob's heart the way hers had once been broken. She sold the wedding ring her husband left behind to buy Jacob his first bicycle, and she watched from the window as he rode it down the street, his laughter like music that made all the hunger and fatigue feel worth it. She cheered at every soccer game, even when she was the only parent there, and celebrated his smallest achievements, like they were Olympic medals, because to her, they were every A on a test, every compliment from a teacher, every sign that he was thriving meant she was doing something right. She saved every drawing, every Mother's Day card, every crumpled note that said, "I love you, Mom," and kept them in a box under her bed like sacred treasures. Jacob grew up knowing he was loved, but never quite understanding the weight of that love, never realizing that behind every yes was a no. She had said to herself, behind every gift was something she had quietly gone without. She never told him about the nights she walked home in the rain because she couldn't afford gas, or the months she went without heat because his school fees had gone up. She smiled through it all, because Jacob was her purpose, her reason for breathing, her proof that something beautiful could come from being abandoned. And when he graduated from college with honors, she sat in the front row with tears streaming down her face, not because he had succeeded, but because she had made good on her promise to give him a better life. She had given him everything and expected nothing in return, not praise, not repayment, just the knowledge that he was okay. And when he got his first job and then his first apartment and called her to say, "Mom, I did it," she felt like the universe had finally given her something back. He would visit every weekend and take her out to lunch, and she thought maybe, just maybe, she hadn't done it all in vain. And then one day he surprised her with keys to a new house and said, "It's yours too. Mom, you're coming to live with me. You took care of me. Now it's my turn." And Helen cried in his arms, believing that finally, after all the years of giving, she could rest, she could exhale, she could be taken care of for once. And for the first few months, it was everything she had dreamed of. They laughed, they watched movies, they cooked together, and she felt like she had built not just a son, but a home. But homes are fragile when they are built on one-sided sacrifice and love that goes unspoken for too long. And everything began to change the day Jacob met Emily. The arrival of Emily into the house brought an invisible shift that Helen felt immediately but struggled to name. Helen had ever known she was younger, fashionable, and carried an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. At first, she smiled politely and tried to welcome Emily as a daughter-in-law should, but it quickly became clear that Emily saw the house and Helen herself as obstacles to her perfect new life. She began to criticize everything from the way Helen arranged the furniture to the meals she prepared. Emily complained that Helen was always in the way, that the house didn't feel like that she was smothering Jacob and that he needed space to build a new family. Helen tried to brush off the comments, hoping they were just nerves or misunderstandings, but Emily's words grew sharper with every passing day. What started as subtle digs became outright complaints to Jacob, who seemed caught between his mother and wife, but increasingly chose to placate. Emily at Helen's expense dinner conversations became battlegrounds filled with silence and awkward glances. Emily avoided sharing anything personal, but her disdain was obvious. She refused to join family gatherings or phone calls. Helen's presence was a wedge that grew larger with every passing week, herself slipping into the background in a place she once called home. She was no longer the mother who nurtured and cared. She was becoming the outsider, the woman who was tolerated, not loved. Back to explain the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights and broken dreams, but she found herself shrinking, retreating into silence, out of exhaustion and heartbreak. Son she had raised with so much hope and endless devotion, she questioned if love alone was enough to hold a family together, and wondered how someone she loved so deeply could so easily let her go while Emily continued to build her life around Jacob. Helen's world grew smaller until it felt like she was living in a house filled with strangers, a prisoner in her own home. On without weapons, but with wounds that cut deeper than any battle. Passing day, she wondered what it would take for Jacob to see her again, not as a burden but as the mother who had given him everything. The evening had fallen into an uneasy silence after a tense dinner where words had been spoken but nothing resolved. Helen sat quietly at the kitchen table, stirring her tea while Jacob stood near the window, staring out into the fading light. She sensed something was coming, something she wasn't prepared for but had feared for weeks. Emily had retreated to their bedroom, leaving the two of them alone, and now Jacob turned toward her, his face troubled and eyes clouded with guilt. It was the kind of look that made her heart ache, but she steeled herself to listen. He cleared his throat and began softly. Mom, we need to talk. I know things have been difficult since Emily moved in, and I've tried to balance both of you, but it's not fair to either of you anymore. I'm sorry, but she feels like you don't respect her as my wife. Helen's hands trembled. She swallowed hard, afraid of what was to come. She asked quietly, what do you mean? And Jacob hesitated, then the words hit her like a punch. Mom, you've done so much for me for all these years, I know that, but Emily deserves more respect. She needs space to build a life with me, and she feels overwhelmed by your presence, by how involved you still are, and I have to put my marriage first. Helen's breath caught in her throat as the weight of his words settled around her like a suffocating fog. She had given her whole life to this son, to this family, and now he was telling her it wasn't enough, that he had to choose between the woman he loved and the mother who had sacrificed everything for him, the man she had raised with her own hands was asking her to leave the home they shared, the place she thought was hers as much as his. The thought of packing her things and walking away felt like a cruel betrayal, a wound that cut deeper than any she had endured before. But Helen knew deep down that this was not just about Emily or Jacob. It was about a shifting power dynamic, a son growing up and taking sides, and a mother forced to reckon with her own fading place in his life. She didn't shout, she didn't beg, she just looked into Jacob's eyes and said, quietly, "I never thought I would hear you say that, but if that's what you need, then I'll leave." She could see the pain in his eyes, to the guilt and sadness mingling with the resolve to stand by his wife. But still, she felt the sting of abandonment, the loss of a role she had cherished for decades. That night, Helen began to pack a small bag with essentials, nothing fancy, just the bare minimum, as she folded old clothes and wrapped fragile keepsakes in tissue paper, memories of years spent loving and sacrificing pressed heavily on her chest. She wondered if Jacob remembered the nights she stayed up nursing him through illness, or the days she skipped meals so he could have shoes that fit the weight of a lifetime of motherhood. Settled around her like a quiet storm, and when she closed the door behind her, she didn't look back. She didn't look back. She walked away with a mixture of heartbreak and dignity, knowing that this chapter of her life had come to a painful end, but also that it was the beginning of something new for both of them, even if she wasn't sure what that something would be. She left with the hope that one day Jacob would understand what she had given him, and that love could still be found in the spaces between words and silence, between what was lost and what might still be saved. Helen stood in the quiet apartment she had chosen after leaving the home she had shared with Jacob for so many years. The walls were bare and the rooms unfamiliar, but they were hers, and for the first time in decades she felt the strange mix of freedom and loneliness that came with starting over. As she unpacked a small box of belongings she had taken from the house, her fingers brushed over a dusty old wooden crate tucked away in the back of a closet, a box she hadn't opened in years. Curiosity and nostalgia urged her to lift the lid. Inside, she found a collection of papers and letters, memories folded and stacked like fragments of a past life. There were yellowed envelopes with Jacob's father's handwriting, letters from her own mother full of advice and love, but most striking of all was a folder filled with financial documents, deeds, and bank statements. She sat down, heavily overwhelmed by the weight of secrets she hadn't realized she was keeping, a secret that now felt like a shield and a sword at once. She learned that years ago, when Jacob had bought the house he insisted they all live in, Helen had quietly contributed a large portion of the down payment from an inheritance she had never told Jacob about. Money she had saved and protected just for him, but money Jacob never acknowledged as hers, or as a gift. She remembered how proud she had felt handing over the check, how she had imagined that this gesture would cement her place in the new chapter of their lives, but it hadn't. She had become invisible to both Jacob and Emily, and this secret investment had been hidden away in plain sight. She realized that she had been treated as a guest rather than a partner in her own son's life, and the injustice burned fiercely in her chest. She felt anger swelling up, a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. The sting of betrayal was sharper now that she knew how much she had given and how little it was valued. The documents reminded her of her quiet strength, the sacrifices she had made in silence, the nights she stayed up worrying, the days she worked 2 jobs to save every penny. Now those efforts had a tangible value, a foothold she could claim, a right she had been denied. She did not rush to confront Jacob or Emily. She knew better than to believe that words alone could fix years of resentment and misunderstanding. Instead, she sat with the papers night after night, turning over the possibility of reclaiming not just her dignity but her rightful share of the home she had helped, by the home she had once called hers. She planned quietly and carefully, deciding that if they wanted to erase her, she would make sure they couldn't forget her. She would not be pushed aside or cast out without a fight. This discovery gave Helen a renewed sense of purpose, a way to stand tall in a situation that had tried to diminish her. She no longer felt like the forgotten mother, but a woman who held power hidden in plain sight, a weapon forged in love and silence, a plan that would make them rethink the meaning of respect and family. In the days that followed, she reached out to a trusted attorney, someone who understood her story and her pain, someone who promised to stand by her, not just as a lawyer but as an ally. She filed papers to assert her legal rights in the house, a move that surprised Jacob and especially Emily, who had never suspected the financial truth. Helen's quiet return was not loud or angry. It was precise, deliberate, and unyielding. It sent ripples through the fragile world Jacob and Emily had built, forcing them to confront the past they had tried to ignore, and Helen found strength in the knowledge that for the first time she was fighting not just to reclaim property but to reclaim respect, to reclaim a place in the family she had nurtured. Embrace whatever came next with courage and grace. After asserting her legal claim, Helen retreated into a new life, one far removed from the suffocating walls of Jacob's house and Emily's cold glare. She found solace in the quiet of her small apartment, where every corner reminded her that this was finally her space, a place untouched by judgment or resentment. Yet the silence was not empty. It was filled with the echoes of years of sacrifice and the simmering fire of quiet revenge. Helen did not seek to humiliate or destroy Jacob or Emily. Instead, she chose to wield the power she had uncovered with calm precision. A letter arrived at Jacob's office one morning, unexpected and formal. It came from Helen's attorney, stating her claim on the house and demanding a discussion on refinancing an ownership division. The news sent shockwaves through Jacob and Emily's carefully constructed world. Their confident veneer cracked as money worries and legal battles crept in. Jacob pleaded with Helen behind closed doors, begging her to reconsider, to find forgiveness, but she held firm, refusing to be swayed by guilt or tears. She had learned over the years that love without respect was hollow, and that some wounds could only be healed with boundaries. Emily's frustration boiled over at the thought of losing control over the house she had insisted was hers. Now she confronted Jacob, accusing him of betrayal and weakness. Their marriage strained under the weight of secrets and resentment that Helen's move had unleashed. The tension spilled into arguments that echoed through the halls of the home Helen once shared with Jacob. The woman who had been pushed aside, watched from a distance as the family she had built fractured, but she was no longer a victim. She was a force, a quiet storm reshaping the balance of power without raising her voice. Helen used her newfound freedom to rediscover passions long buried. She traveled to places she had only dreamed of, visited art galleries, took painting classes, and even started writing. Her memoirs, a new chapter, blossomed from the ashes of loss and betrayal. She found joy in solitude and strength in independence. While Jacob and Emily scrambled to repair their fractured life, Helen's life flourished quietly away from the spotlight. Until one day the unexpected happened. A letter arrived from Jacob, a brief note, hoping she was well and wishing for some kind of peace. No apology, no explanation, just a tentative step toward connection. Helen read it and folded it carefully, choosing silence over response, knowing that some bridges must be rebuilt slowly, if at all. Months turned into seasons, and Helen's presence in Jacob's life remained a delicate balance. But she had changed. She no longer measured her worth by their acceptance. Instead, she measured it by her own happiness and resilience, and in that transformation lay her true revenge, not one of bitterness or spite, but of reclaiming herself, finally choosing to live on her own terms and showing Jacob that respect is not given lightly, but earned through strength and dignity. Helen sat quietly in the small sunlit cafe overlooking the sea, a place she had chosen for herself. Far from the storms of her past, she had traveled here alone, carrying nothing but a suitcase and the heavy yet freeing knowledge that her life was finally hers to live. She thought back on the years of sacrifice, the sleepless nights, the endless giving, and the heartbreaking moment when the son she loved told her to leave. She remembered the pain, the betrayal, but more than that, she felt a profound sense of rebirth, a woman reborn from ashes and silence. She had found strength not in revenge or confrontation, but in choosing herself, in reclaiming her dignity and joy. Helen reconnected with old friends who had once faded into the background of her busy life and made new ones in art classes and local gatherings. She began painting again, vibrant colors pouring from her brush, a language of emotions she had long suppressed. Her memoir took shape, filling pages with stories of love, loss, resilience, and hope. She discovered passions that had been dormant while she lived only for others, and in doing so, she rediscovered a purpose that was hers alone. Each day was no longer measured by the sacrifices she made, but by the moments she claimed for herself, the laughter shared over coffee, the gentle breeze on the beach, the quiet pride in her own accomplishments. Helen's heart softened. Even for Jacob, who still lingered in the corners of her thoughts, she understood now that love was complicated, messy, and sometimes imperfect, but it was also capable of healing if given time and space. She knew their relationship would never be the same, and maybe that was okay. Maybe what mattered most was not the past, but the future. She would write her story on her own terms, a testament to survival and strength. And when Emily unexpectedly showed up at her door, one rainy afternoon, with tears in her eyes and an apology, Helen listened with grace. Neither bitterness nor anger clouded her words. Instead, she offered a quiet compassion born of experience, a recognition of pain and growth. Emily confessed her insecurities, her fears of being overshadowed by a mother she could never measure up to, and Helen in turn forgave, not for Emily but for herself, freeing her from the burden of resentment that had weighed her down for so long. In the end, Helen's journey was not about reclaiming a house or winning a battle, but about finding peace within herself, a peace that no one could take away. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of gold and pink, Helen smiled softly, knowing she had finally come home to herself, ready to embrace whatever life would bring next with open arms and an open heart.